Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. Boy, what a show this week. We got an email, and you can give us a little more background because this gentleman reached out directly to you, Clay, but we received an email from Vince DiPiazza, who is the city manager of Uvalde, Texas. You wrote back to him and said, we'd like you to come on the show and discuss this, and he was gracious enough to immediately respond, and, well, that's the show this week.
Well, Vince is a longtime listener to the Jefferson Hour, and he has things he wants to say, and so he reached out to us and said that he would be willing, although he's not eager, to appear on the Jefferson Hour to talk a little bit about this. He's the city manager, which is an appointive office. It's not an elective office. But David, you can imagine that in the aftermath of this, with the scrutiny by the media, by politics, by national law enforcement, and so on, by Congress, that the pressures on the mayor, on the city council, on the city manager and their staff have to be gigantic. And so even that he had time to spend with us to talk is interesting to me. And I thought he had... he really did not want to talk about the great national U.S. gun debate. He wanted to talk about what we can do if nothing changes in our gun laws.
This was really hard on me,
You've undergone something similar to some of this.
Well, yeah, I lost a child about 15 years ago. And, so I keep coming back to that. And it's, as I said, it's a club, it's kind of an exclusive club that nobody wants to join. But I keep coming
remember,
back
can I just bring this, can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
I was here when that happened. I had just moved back. I knew you, but we weren't great friends and colleagues the way we have become. We hadn't spent this hundreds and hundreds of hours in the saddle with Thomas Jefferson. But I remember that as if it were yesterday. And of course, my memory is going to be so much more limited than yours. But I remember this. I came down to the studio. We were about to do a Jefferson Hour or two. And I asked you some questions about your son. And I remember you're saying, thank you. People don't want to talk about it. People don't want to talk. They don't want to bring it up. They feel they're being especially sympathetic or kind by pretending it, in a sense, it never happened. And you said, we have to talk about it. We have to talk about it. I remember that so well.
I don't know that that's true for everybody, but it was for me, just a chance to say his name and recall things about him. But, the larger point, aside from my own feelings about it, is that, there are families and parents in Texas, and I just can't get past that.
And uncles and aunts and cousins and, in-laws. These are, one death to your fourth grade child is not a nuclear family situation. It has waves that go far, far, far beyond that.
Right. Yeah. And it's as a parent, you're broken forever. I hate to say that, but it's the truth. You never recover from it. You go on, you live your life, but I keep thinking of these parents. I mean, it's not a natural thing to have a child die. It's just not. And you can't reason it out, and you keep thinking that, well, no, they're going to come back, for me, 15 years later, none of that's changed. There's a certain part of you that's just lost forever. So, I have the greatest sympathy for those folks. Well, let's go on to the show. But this was very brave of Vince to do this. He had some great insight. I was really glad that it didn't devolve into a gun debate. It was very constructive, and I know you and all of our listeners would wish those folks in Uvalde the best.
Well, we're going to have the great gun debate. This wasn't that day. This was our chance to look at this through an insider's lens, to hear from somebody on the ground who doesn't have any bombast in him or some political axe to grind or some score to settle, I was so impressed by how careful and dispassionate he was and how much he wanted to avoid getting involved in the usual madness of who's to blame and and who should pay the price and etc. I thought it was so measured and therefore so important. And when I first got the email, I thought, oh, this is sort of maybe an area that I don't particularly want to go into. But I'm glad that we did. But let me just say this much before we go to the show. We're going to have this debate. Congress is having this debate. Some state legislatures are having this debate. And the question is there anything we can do about this that stands a rational chance of making this less likely or even impossible? And that debate goes all the way from banning certain types of weapons and universal background checks and closing the trade show loophole and closing the boyfriend loophole and so on. Red flags at one end of the spectrum. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there's the sort of NRA motto, guns don't kill people, people kill people, and everything in between. But the fact is, if you look at this from an outsider's point of view, from Europe, from Asia, these rational human beings in other countries are saying, how can the United States see this happening again and again and again and again and again and again and never do anything meaningful about it? That's the question. There's no answer that I particularly want to endorse here, but our friends elsewhere are saying, what sort of a civilization just routinizes this and wrings its hands for 3.5 months or 3.5 weeks or 3.5 days and then goes right back to the same set of sociological conditions or the same gun culture, the same Second Amendment culture that makes this not just an occasional event, but 4, 5, 10 times per year in the United States? And this conversation has to occur. It's to me, the fact that we don't want to have this conversation or that we refuse ever to get serious about it is really an indictment, not of the Second Amendment. It's an indictment of American civilization. And I don't know what the answer is, David, and I know you don't know what the answer is, but I know that wringing our hands is clearly not going to prevent this. Let's go to the show.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm your host, David Swinson. I'm joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. We have a very special guest joining us this week. Clay, could you please introduce him?
I'd be happy to. As everybody knows, on May 24th, 2022, there was a mass shooting, yet another mass shooting, this one in Uvalde, Texas, and 19 fourth graders, 19 children were killed and 2 teachers. It seems like this is an endless loop in America, that every few months something like this happens somewhere and we wring our hands for a while and propose changes, and then the media leaves and we go back to our normal lives and wait for the next one. But we have a very important guest with us today, a longtime listener to the Jefferson Hour, Vince DiPiazza, who is the city manager of Uvalde. And Vince, let me say thank you for volunteering to speak with us. We are most eager to get a sense of this from someone who was so close to this catastrophic event. So welcome to the Jefferson Hour.
Thank you for having me.
So you're the city manager. How long have you been the city manager?
Oh, about 7.5 years.
How many people live in Uvalde?
Roughly 16,000.
And where is it located precisely?
It's about 90 miles west of San Antonio and 50 miles, give or take, north of the Mexican border.
What's the basic economy there?
It's typically been sort of rural, agricultural. There's a lot of farming around here. Like a lot of places like that, it's transitioning to some degree. It's something of a tourist and hunting mecca. Lots of ranches in the area, which I would characterize mostly as hobby ranches. But the town itself has a real blue collar feel to it. That's kind of that's kind of where our roots are.
On May 20th of this year, that is 4 days before the event, what were the things that, as a city manager, you had to spend your time doing or thinking about?
Well, it's the normal business of a city, maintaining infrastructure, making sure police patrol the streets. A lot of my time is spent with things that most of us would rather not think about, like removing trash and sewage and that kind of thing.
So relatively routine matters that any city manager of a small community anywhere would have to do. I think it's fair to say that almost no American knew of the existence of your town until this happened.
That's probably true. Our historical claim to fame is a vice president of the United States that was from here, John Nance Garner.
Who said a very nasty thing about the vice presidency.
Vice presidency, yes.
You know, David, he is said to have said it's not worth a bucket of spit.
Yes.
So that's a pretty interesting small claim to fame. We have no such person here on the high Great Plains.
I've been to your website just to take a look, and it's a beautiful little town. I don't know if I want to say a sleepy, small Midwestern town, but watching the drone flyovers on the website and being from a small Midwestern town, I could relate.
So I think we have a sense of this, Vince, and we're really eager now to hear you walk us through this. Where were you when the flash came to you?
Well, when I first started getting the reports, I was here in my office. Immediately tried to get in touch with my police chief, who actually was out of town. So things were going hot and heavy pretty quickly. Law enforcement response, obviously. And we have a lot of law enforcement people in our community right now, in part because, well, mostly because of the border crisis. They were already here. We have a border patrol station with about 150 agents that work out of it, many of them who live in our town. We had lots of folks from the Department of Public Safety, our state troopers who've been here. The border area for a while now has been lots of flows of undocumented migrants that are coming through here. And prior to that, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that we've had nearly daily incidents of trafficking of migrants through the community, and so through and around. And that's where the law enforcement presence was. So my first thought was, we got plenty of people to respond to this. There may have been too many people. I don't really know. That story has yet to be fully told. But so I was in contact with my chief, who was in contact with his people on the scene, and our mayor too, who's essentially an elected volunteer, showed up at the command post down there across the street from the school.
So if I had been in your position, I would have wanted to get up out of my desk and go somewhere. What's the role of a city manager at this point?
I've been out and about with responses to various disaster situations, but this was a law enforcement thing, and I didn't think another body down there was going to be an advantage in any way. We have all the communication technology that anyone else has, and we were getting reports as it was coming in. So I felt that this particular instance, my best place was to be here and relay information and just sort of monitor what was going on.
I would guess the phone's ringing off the hook, that you're making calls, that you're trying to make contact with people, that you're trying to make sure you know exactly what's going on. Tell us about, how you manage the first few hours of this.
You're a little bit conflicted on wanting to know the information and not wanting to tie up the people that are on the scene that are dealing with this. The whole thing was over in roughly an hour or less. And then the aftermath and the questions and the parents, obviously lots of parents concerned about their children. We said we have a local civic center that we set up as kind of the place for the parents to go. And then the day went by, which was mostly, I hate to say this, the people that were wounded were transported for medical services, and the rest of it was in essence a crime scene with bodies. I'm sorry.
We understand how difficult this is.
That part of it, the image of dead children and the teachers, is a difficult one to get out of your mind. I didn't look at any photographs, and I wasn't at the scene, but I have police officers that I've talked to, and they relayed some of the details, and it is something that's hard to get out of your mind. So it took a long time. It took a lot longer than I thought it should to match the parents with the victims. But if you know anything about guns, you can imagine what an AR-15 will do to a 10-year-old child. And it took a while. It took a long time to. A number of parents were waiting. They knew the later it got that it was likely that their children were not going to be among the survivors. So it was a difficult situation for them, I'm sure. I was in and out of the Civic Center while this was going on.
So you're saying that the massive firepower of an AR-15 so damaged the bodies of these 10-year-olds that it was hard to identify some of them.
Yes, and the cruelty of the shooter. I think a local pediatrician gave some testimony on that at Congress, maybe a week after the event.
All right, so now by the end of the day, the facts of death, injury, etc. are known. The city's still in shock. It's a small enough city that everybody must have known somebody who's child or teacher, or that there can't have been many people in the community that weren't touched by this in a way that they would not have been in Seattle necessarily, or Los Angeles or New York.
22 families, but their families, their extended families, their friends. Some of my staff had children on sports teams that played with children of the victims. So it did reach deep into the community, and it is. We talk stereotypically about small, tight-knit communities, and this one is pretty much that way.
What happens on day 2, day 3, day 4?
As you might expect, as news came out, we received an outpouring of offers for assistance, and they're the official ones from the folks that are geared up to respond to these sort of things. The FEMA and the Texas Division of Emergency Management. Every city in the region offered assistance of one kind or another. We took advantage of some of that, particularly in the area of extra law enforcement. And then the calls from all over the country for people who probably couldn't find Uvalde on a map, never heard of it, like you said earlier, wanting to help, wanting to express their sympathy. I think people truly hurting by the nature of the incident, sharing that hurt along with us. And so the phones were ringing nonstop, and emails flying in for the next, I think it's about a week after that, but it started that afternoon as the news came out.
You said you got calls from other communities, law enforcement, FEMA, etc. Did you get calls from citizens who are unofficial, who offered to come in some way?
Yes, lots of those too. People want to feel like they can be of assistance. They want to help. Again, the nature of this incident has touched a lot of people deeply, and so one of the things was that's a thing after an event like this is trying to handle the assistance. We didn't want to turn anybody away or dismiss them, but we started making lots of lists and said, if we can take advantage of this, we'll try to contact you later. Money, from almost the very beginning, there were offers to fund the funeral expenses, to help pay for medical expenses, just to help the families out. That started coming in almost immediately too. At least the offers did.
So we're going to take a break here in a minute, Vince, but I'm going to ask a difficult question. Did you get disturbing calls?
I was going to get to that, actually. Yes. So I would say it was probably running 50%, which is difficult to understand. Some of the most vile, vitriolic things that you can imagine in a situation like this, where the community is grieving. And my staff, it's City Hall. We can't stop answering the phones here. So my staff had to put up with a lot of that. And it was difficult for them with the situation, knowing people involved, knowing the community, and hearing the most vile things that you can imagine. Mostly having to do with, I'll say, this Texas gun culture. That seems to be a running theme. As the story about the law enforcement response became somewhat problematic, we heard a lot about that. our mayor, who was at a press conference with the governor, had an unfortunate emotional outburst.
Vince, we want to thank you so much for coming on to the Thomas Jefferson Hour and talking about this. I know I can't imagine how difficult it must be for you. We really appreciate your time. We need to take a short break. We'll come back to this conversation in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, a difficult conversation. Vince DiPiazza, who is the city manager of Uvalde, Texas, contacted the Thomas Jefferson Hour, and we asked him to join us in conversation this week. When we took our break, you were talking about something pretty difficult, and that was the calls that your office got and the reactions of some people and the gun culture. I really don't even know how we can make that Jeffersonian, but let's try.
When I mentioned that one of the things that we were hearing was about the gun culture in Texas, was typically from people who are on the other side of that issue, from folks that think we're way overboard with that sort of thing here, that we are too lax in our gun laws, and in a sense that this sort of thing is almost deserved because of that. Those were difficult. On the other side, I mentioned the mayor earlier. Mayor McLaughlin is a pretty conservative fellow, a gun aficionado, but even he has come out and said that he wouldn't be opposed to some reasonable restrictions on, particularly on the sale of those type of weapons to young people, and background checks. He doesn't think that's a problem, and he's a guy that owns a lot of guns, has hunted, keeps them for personal safety, all that kind of thing. This is one of the topics I don't really want to get into too deep, because I think it turns into something like guns good, guns bad, and then we argue at each other and we get nowhere. We get absolutely nowhere.
I read that in your email, and I really appreciated that sentiment.
I want to give you a sense, though, because Clay asked about an example of the kind of call you were getting. So this one particularly stands out in my mind. Our city secretary here is a person who she's got a young family, and she's got children that were on sports teams with some of the deceased children. And after being lambasted about how could she work for an organization like this, you guys are terrible. Hope your kids are next.
Oh my. Here's my thought about this. Something like this happens. There's no way you can say that this is not a horrible, appalling, unnecessary incident that raises all the worst questions about guns and Americans and so on. I can't understand how anyone from the left or the right would disturb the flow of calls into the city manager's office at this time to opinionate about guns, or how dare you this, or make sure you don't do that, or you deserve this because of Texas's gun culture and so on. I try to think, what would it take for me to intrude in a FEMA emergency with some knuckleheaded opinion that I happen to have about a town I've never been to in a state that I've seldom visited? Doesn't that, David, seem to you like that's also a disease?
It's fear. It's the desire to have a rule that you can fall back on that's right or wrong, black and white, and very simple. But I get really frustrated with this. I keep coming back to it took the death of all of these children and citizens of Texas to get Congress to move. I mean,
if it moves,
we should be a bit ashamed of ourselves that it took this kind of a tragedy to make things move. I mean, I struggle with that.
Vince, let me ask you this question. A year ago, 6 months ago, or a month ago, could you have imagined as the city manager that something like this could happen in Uvalde?
Well, I guess on an abstract level, I think we all know, because there've been so many of these kind of events, that the mass shooting thing could happen in your town. And there are plans in place, and law enforcement trains to react to these events. And I think the emphasis is on the word react, and that's something I'd like to talk about in a little while. But no, I mean, when it really presents itself, it's almost unbelievable. It took me several days after the event to not wake up in the morning in the fog of first thing I hear is, the radio on NPR, of course. And then they're talking about it the first thing when I wake up in the morning. I go, no, this was real. This really happened here.
So you actually, the first morning had to kind of realize again that this thing that wasn't a nightmare, it wasn't a bad dream, that this had happened.
Yeah, and I think I've talked to several people who had similar experiences that, in the same way. It seemed like a nightmare, and when you get up in the morning, you were reminded, in fact, that it was real.
I'd like to know more about you, Vince. I mean, tell us what kind of a gentleman you are.
Well, like I said, I've been in this business for a long time. I actually intended to do this. I got exposure to the profession through my mother, incidentally, who worked for a city manager in the town that we moved to when we first moved to Texas in the mid-'70s. So I got to know those folks, and it seemed like an interesting job. And so I ended up getting a degree in political science and another one in public administration, and then worked my way up in the business. And I've managed small towns. My previous position before Uvalde was a small town in the Texas Panhandle on the southern end of the High Plains, Dumas, Texas.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, you said in your email that there was a Kansas connection, that you had seen Clay in performance, and
it would have been either the late 90s or 2000, right around that time. It was, I believe Clay was at Garden City High School auditorium, perhaps, and I was the assistant city manager in Garden City at the time. My brief foray out of state. I've spent most of my career in Texas, but I had 5 years in Kansas, and Kansas, the western Kansas, western Oklahoma, western Nebraska, eastern Colorado, eastern New Mexico, and the Texas Panhandle and South Plains are all, to me, kind of a very similar area to where you guys are. The southern end of the High Plains was similar economy, similar solid people, just a wonderful area.
So you've been in many small communities in the Midwest in your career, and I keep thinking about Uvalde and how can that be different from the town I live in or the many cities that you've worked in. I mean, this kind of violence and tragedy, none of us are immune from that. We like to think in our little town that we're safe, that, that would never happen here, but it can happen anywhere.
It can, and Uvalde may be like all those other towns. Maybe the one difference is the proximity to the border and the sort of the bicultural culture that has evolved here over the years. I don't know. That's probably incidental to what we're really talking about, but I think it's interesting. And being, at 7.5 years, I'm still relatively a newcomer to this part of the state, although I'm familiar with it from travels. And my first full-time job in city government was up the road from here in another hill country town called Kerrville. But the border has always been fluid. I mean, people have, at least until recent times, lots of back and forth. That still goes on, but it's probably not as prominent as it used to be. Families on both sides. My wife is Hispanic. She's of native Texan, and her mother's family is from the area south of San Antonio. And for all we can determine, they were here for a long time, and they never actually crossed the border. The border crossed them at some point in history. And there's a lot of folks like that in this part of the world. Their roots are deep in sort of the Texas-Mexican connection, so to speak.
So do you have children yourself?
I do. Mine are grown and out of the house. So,
but you had to think of that. I mean, when this happened, you had to think, what if my children were in that school?
Right. And I have grandchildren now, and my oldest just turned 10, would have been the same age as the kids in that classroom.
I want to go back to this. I want to get on pretty quickly here to what you think needs to happen. And I don't necessarily mean that about the national gun regulation debate, but what needs to happen in a more maybe a more spiritual sense. But just this, when this first happens, it's sort of like Maslow's hierarchy. You do what you have to do to stabilize the situation. So you apprehend the shooter. You, if you can, you see to the wounded. You create instant support and counseling for the families. You coordinate outside law enforcement agencies that are coming to town, etc. But it doesn't take very long, and I watch this unfold on national news, before hard questions begin to be asked. Why was the response so late? Was there cowardice involved? Did a teacher leave a door open? These kind of questions of wanting to assign responsibility and blame come pretty quickly in situations like this. And I don't know this, but I'm guessing that even as city manager, you felt scrutiny.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, our police department was one of several agencies on the scene, but obviously we're the local police, and so we have a very prominent part in that. The police chief of Uvalde is my appointment, so he works for me, and we have a close working relationship. So you can't, yeah, you're part of that. You're part of the scrutiny. I'm part of the decision making on responding to media requests and that sort of thing, which there are a lot of, and we've taken some hits for lack of a better term, I'll say for transparency. But we're sort of caught in the middle here, and I think this is a story that needs to come out. Investigations are going on, and the district attorneys. But actually, we've got 4 investigations going on. The Texas Rangers, part of the DPS, the initial investigating agency. We've got, because we thought we were not getting necessarily a fair shake, the mayor asked the president, when the president came to town, if he would have the Justice Department review the investigation. We have the local district attorney, and we have now a committee of legislators from the Texas House that are sitting in our council chambers upstairs from here, and they've taken up residence in our small city hall. And to me, it's a bit of a circus environment for that. But so those things are all going on. Everybody wants answers. We're being told not to say too much. So I mean, it's particularly by the district attorney and the Texas Rangers. You can't. This is an ongoing investigation, and our own legal team. It's not surprising that the lawyers were involved pretty early. And we're as frustrated. We're probably almost as frustrated as the public in terms of what we're finding out, because it seems that some of the press may know a little more about this than we do, and I'm not sure how they're getting their information. But
if I were in your situation and just sleepless, working 18, 20 hours a day, when not actively making calls or taking them or doing other things of that sort, agonizing and reflecting and trying to stay focused, the last thing I want to see is the politicians come rolling over the hill in their cars, because they're politicians, and that means that their methods are not necessarily dedicated to the search for truth or the stabilizing of a situation. There's inevitably grandstanding. They suck some of the oxygen out of the room. They take time. They force you to give time to something where your time might be better spent somewhere in some other way. I know you want to be careful about that, but that has to be a frustrating part of this.
Yes, it is, and and you're right about the politicking. So this is one of the things too. I've always wanted to make a point about a small town city council. Like I mentioned earlier, my mayor is a pretty conservative guy. He would probably not be inclined to ask any favors of the current presidential administration, but he did that day and had a civil conversation with our president. And we have civil conversations here when we're deciding policy at the local level, particularly in a small town, because these people, they know everyone. You see them in the grocery store, you see them in church. They're part of the community. They're not in some office in Washington or Austin with their staff surrounding them, that kind of thing. They're out here with everybody. You can talk to the mayor. You can call him at his home and he'll answer. That's the kind of thing in a small town like this. And although he's very conservative politically, I don't think he has that luxury in his position as mayor of a small town. We've got practical problems that we have to solve, and he doesn't approach them in an ideological way, and neither do the rest of the council. They don't always agree, but they generally find common ground and make decisions, and we move on. That's the way I think politics is supposed to work.
I want you to try to sort this out. and I'm not even sure how to ask the question, but on the one hand, you're sorrowing, you're grieving, you're mourning, you're disturbed in a very profound way by this. Then there's a second range where you are frustrated because you want answers and you want to give answers and you want to do this right, and not everything goes smoothly in a situation like this. Not only politicians roll in, but so do all the networks and all the cable shows and all the bloggers and social media and so on. And then there's the third area where, and you tell me, but I'm guessing you're also hurt because there is the blame game, and because of the rage and the misrepresentations and so on. So how are you managing the emotional toll of this thing? And you're not one of the grieving families, it should be said.
No, I'm not. I'm grieving like the community is, and grieving the fact that something like this could have happened here, and feeling the pain in a detached way, I guess, from the families are the ones that are truly in pain. And then the whole type of incident. I mean, we understand natural disasters and tragedies like that, but this was not a natural disaster. And one of the things that really hurts about this, that the kid that did this, he was one of us. He was from here. He grew up in this community, and this is something that there again, I'd like to get to more of in a moment. But yeah, the press comes in here for a couple of weeks. They talk to folks. Lots of people are willing to talk. Those tend to be people with strong opinions. The families that have been involved in this. One of the issues we've had is the press, barging into funerals, or at least trying to. We've tried to keep that under control, and the press has criticized us for that. We're impeding them from doing their jobs, but the families are tired, and I'm sure they'll have, as they move further along in the grieving and anger takes over, I'm sure they'll have some stories to tell there. But I wish the national press in particular would have backed off and let us get through the initial shock and grief of this before they were so obtrusive. The last funeral that's going to be have here of one of the children was yesterday. I happen to be a musician as well, an amateur, and I was part of the music for that service. And you're part of the community. You do these things, and then I have official duties too, and our staff and council are the same way. And you're a part of it. You're part of it on a personal level and on a professional level.
You've said several times that there are things that you want to say, and I want to make sure we give you a chance to do that. But one last question along these lines. As you look at what happened in the aftermath, how well did the city and did law enforcement handle this crisis?
The crisis, the aftermath of it?
Well, the immediate, going there, we've heard about the delays in getting into the room and so on. You're an insider. Give us your best sense of how well this was handled.
I wish I could give you more detail. I think I'm going to have to just leave it at I think the full story is yet to be told. There are a number of factors, I think, that are not getting as much attention. I'd love to tell you more, and I guess the bottom line is we hope that the details and the truth of the event come out. If we have to take some lumps over it, we'll have to take those, because that will be the truth if that's what comes out of this. But I think it's going to be a lot more complicated situation than people are thinking right now. And we live in a culture that wants quick, easy, Twitter-sized answers.
We're talking with Vince DiPiazza, the city manager of Uvalde, Texas, who was there, of course, on that horrible day, May 24th. We have many more questions for you, Vince. We're going to take a short break. You're listening to a special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, an insider's view of what happened on May 24th and its aftermath. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to this sad but important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We're talking with City Manager Vince DiPiazza, a longtime listener to the Jefferson Hour. He was there on that fatal day, May 24th, 2022. 19 children killed, 2 teachers Uh, he contacted the Jefferson Hour because he thought that this is something that needs to be talked about from somebody who was there. And so, Vince, I really want to get to that. But let me ask one last question about the national narrative of this. I follow these things as much as one does. They're so wearying. It's like, oh, this time it's Uvalde, then it's Parkland, then it's Buffalo, then it's San Bernardino. If you don't live there, you sort of chalk it up to this national mania. But if you live there, of course, it's a shattering event, and it's hard to understand how the community ever really is the same, and maybe it can't ever really be the same. But do you think that the national narrative, which is that they did a pretty good job, but there were some delays, and there's a little bit of kind of Mayberry Barney Fife narrative that's going on nationally. How do you think that's grossly unfair, partly unfair? How would you characterize it?
I think it's unfair. Our law enforcement people at all levels, so the city police department, the school, the sheriff's department, the DPS, the border patrol. I think, well, those are the primary agencies that were on the scene. Those people, including ours, are well trained. They've been through these scenarios before, or at least in training. Nobody's ever faced this thing for real, and I would say probably that every situation is different. And I think one of the things that might come out of this is some rethinking of what to do. It's frustrating in a way because, well, okay, so now we're going to rethink security. We may take different approaches, and once again, after the fact, we're going to harden the targets. We're going to put more police officers in the school. I don't know what we're going to do in Texas if we're going to talk about arming teachers or that kind of thing. That's possible, I suppose. All those things are after the fact solution. When the kid that did this, and he committed a monstrous act, but it's been becoming more and more hard for me to think of him as a monster when I find out a little bit more about his life and his upbringing. And
let's talk about that. He's a kid that has ties to the community. Give us a sense of who he is, and you saying your view of him is changing somewhat.
Okay, so the young man, and 18 years old, apparently old enough to buy that kind of weapon in Texas, but I still think of him as a kid who inflicted this sort of thing on the kids in his own community. And he was being raised at the moment by his grandparents. He comes from a problematic family environment. He's had an issue with school attendance. I believe the narrative is that he is a dropout. I don't know all the details, so some of this might be not entirely accurate, but he had, like so many others, he left clues behind, clues in social media, clues in his behavior. He had some problematic behaviors at school. It's hard to look at what we know about him now and think that we didn't miss some clues along the way. The fact that this kid was troubled and he was on a path that had we intervened earlier, we might have been able to nudge him off. And I think this is the key that we need to focus on in these events. The gun debate, like we said, it sucks all the air out of the debate and ends up polarizing people. And we may or may not be able to do anything about guns, and they may or may not be effective in the long run. I don't know, but we have to figure out how to stop making mass shooters.
If you had a red flag law in Texas, would he have tripped the switch?
I don't believe so, because his only criminal record was as a juvenile. So I've been told that as soon as he turned 18, that was basically a non-factor. And that may be something that needs to be addressed in the red flag laws. But my understanding is that would not have come up. But before that, there were multiple red flags, you might say. And if we had a program in place to identify those kids and then intervene in their lives earlier, and I'm not a social scientist. I don't know all the details, but I know that the idea is not original. There are places they're doing some of these things right now. There are academics that have done research in it. I've started to reach out to those people. I'm learning as I do some more research that there are schools around the country that are part of these programs to identify these at-risk children. Social media has a role in this, I think, and I realize that raises privacy issues and that sort of thing. But that's one of the places where, particularly the and I'm going to call him the angry young male, who seems to be a kind of a common denominator in these shootings. It's not universal, but that seems to be a commonality among these incidents. And they do leave clues on social media, and I think we can figure this out. And putting those clues together, schools talk to us, they identify this sort of thing. If the families reach out and know that they can, and that combined with some effort to look at what posts are being made in social media, we can maybe spot kids who need, I'm going to call it a soft intervention. You don't send the cops to their house immediately. You send a social worker, or you send a law enforcement officer trained in mental health, and you find out what's up with this kid. For some of them, the intervention might be not much more than making sure they have a decent meal once in a while. For others, they may need some mentoring. For others, they may need some psychological help. But the earlier we do this, if we catch a little bit of this on the front end, maybe we can nudge these kids off the path. And in any event, they're not all going to end up being mass shooters. We know that. They may not all end up being criminals, but any intervention, it would seem like, has a good chance of improving their lives in the future.
The description you made of an alienated 18-year-old kid who's dropped out of school, who's had some discipline problems, there's truancy, he's had some brushes with the law. That's a pretty common thing in America, but not 1 in 1,000, not 1 in 100,000 takes an AR-15 into a public place.
Well, and the one factor I omitted was the bullying. I think he was both a perpetrator of and a recipient of bullying, and that seems to be a thing in schools these days too. And you're right. I'm sure there's some smarter people than me that can hone the information down and take a more sophisticated approach than I'm outlining, and not waste intervention on kids who are going through some temporary trouble if it's serious. But if we don't start asking those questions, if we don't start talking to those children, we're going to continue to have this problem. And the guns are an issue, I think, but what's more an issue to me is how do you create a person that's capable of picking a gun and shooting a bunch of children?
Why did he do this?
Why? That's a good question. I don't know that we know that, really.
What's your best sense?
A troubled kid on a bad path, acting out some anger in a way that we seem to be desensitized to through our culture, through our reality, through the games they play, all that kind of thing. I've never considered myself, somebody who wants to restrict people's free speech, but maybe violent video games and violent media ought to be restricted to young people, and are restricted from young people. And there are people, we've had those kinds of things in our history. And First Amendment stuff, I'm a Jeffersonian at heart. More information is better. Freedom, the bad stuff is taken care of by the good speech. The bad speech is taken care of. I believe that all on an abstract level, but this is a dilemma in our society, right? The conflict between freedom and security, which moves back and forth over time based on what's going on in your society at the time.
Why fourth graders? If I'm a disaffected 18-year-old and I'm going to take a gun somewhere, I hate to even talk about it, but I might want to get revenge against my peers. I might want to get revenge against teachers. I might want to take out, who knows? But why would anyone target fourth graders who they're not connected to this story in any way?
I don't know. That's a mystery to all of us. That it reminds us a little bit of Newtown, Connecticut, and Sandy Hook.
It's almost like this kid who he had no sense of reality. I mean, how can you have a sense of reality and want to do something like that? There's this great Lakota saying that keeps coming back to me about, you act as if you have no relatives. There's no connection. What's being done to help those who are left?
Counseling services have been going on since the event has taken place. We had a lot of offers for that we've sort of banked too. So I suspect this is going to be a fairly lengthy ongoing operation. How do you talk to kids in schools? I don't know. Parents are right now, I'm sure this happening all over the country, are rethinking whether they want to send their kids to school, whether they want to school them at home, if they want to send them to different schools. I'm sure that dynamic is occurring in many places right now.
In the several minutes that we have left, what have we not talked about? What have we missed that you'd like to address?
Well, I don't know that there's anything we missed, but I think I want to emphasize again that I think we have the knowledge to attempt to intervene in the lives of young people that may be headed down a destructive path like this. I think we know how to do this. I think social scientists, I think there's data, in other words. I think there's data to support the idea that we could identify kids at risk. And I think we know enough to know how to intervene. The question is, how serious are we about preventing this stuff? How serious are we about addressing it on the front end rather than the back end after the bullets have been fired? It takes resources, and I think this is one of the things I've coming to realize. Even the state of Texas is not known for maybe being the most progressive in its politics. In 2019, the legislature established an organization that's I forget what it's called, Childhood Mental Health Consortium or something like that, with the idea of doing exactly what I'm talking about. The problem is, does it have enough resources? Does it have enough reach in the state yet? It appears not to. One of the articles that was in the media, the Texas Tribune, was that program hadn't made it to us in Uvalde yet. So it's out there. We know how to do this. We just need the resolve to commit some resources to it.
So, Vince, let me ask you a couple of quick questions here. We talk about parents. Of course, the perpetrator has parents. And although they don't sound like Rotarians, they're grieving too. This is a very hard time for them. What can you tell us about them?
Don't know a lot about them. Most of the information I've got is secondhand. Again, they've had issues in their lives with law and with substance abuse. I mean, and this is not a family of great means either in all respects. Very modest house. The kid was living with his grandparents, and I shouldn't neglect to say that the grandmother was the first victim in this thing.
Right.
He shot her at the very beginning, and then went to the school. So they're suffering in their own way, I'm sure, and I don't know how much sympathy they're getting from the community. It's another one of those things, I'm sure there's a lot of that, that apple didn't fall too far from the tree talk, but that's probably unfair.
Yeah, it's hard. These are very complex.
People of modest means, they have a tough time, in the modern economy.
So what happens next, Vince? I mean, in situations like this, of course, it's an impossible question, but I come from a town in western North Dakota, so not so dissimilar from yours, and it had 13,000 people when I was growing up, about double that now. If this happened in that town, it's hard for me to think that the town could ever be the same. That 4 years from now, it's not the same 4th of July. It's not the same Thanksgiving. It's not the same homecoming or baccalaureate. What's your sense of what happens to Uvalde?
I think, we've just been added to a list of communities that have gone through this. And I think it's even worse for a small town, because people don't know about you, but the one thing they will know from here on out is it's this place where this terrible thing happened. And I think this is going to be a long road of recovery, and the town trying to get its identity back. There's 16,000 good people here, and it's unfair to characterize the town because of this incident. And we're talking about how we won't ever forget this, but we've got to get past it somehow. And it'll always be a part of our history. Hopefully there'll be a way to turn that into something good. We owe that to the victims.
When this high school graduation occurs for this class 8 or so years from now, there are going to be some blank silhouettes on that stage. I mean, in other words, this isn't something that 2 years from now is in the past. This stays with it, those families, that class, that school. And so we just feel heartbroken for you. And you really helped us. And I think listeners to the Jefferson Hour, we appreciate your candor. We can tell from the tone of your voice how hard this is and how much you carry. just this one quick last question, Vince. What do you want the listeners to the Jefferson Hour to do?
I think I would like the listeners of the Jefferson Hour to talk about the issues that I was talking about in terms of spending public treasure and effort on trying to stop these things from happening by derailing the problematic children. I mean, it's kids. I think I'm talking about early intervention to get them off that path that leads to tragedy like this. I think we know how to do this. I think we can. I think we need some resolve. It's become way too simple in our politics to talk about after the fact solutions. We don't do a very good job on the prevention. We really don't, and it doesn't play well. It's always easy to talk about more cops, more laws, more this, more that, and less about stuff which is hard to measure. I mean, I've always been fond of asking police chiefs that I work with, how many crimes did you prevent today? It's something that can't really be measured very well, and we won't be able to measure, I don't think, except over a long period of time, if we actually, if the effort becomes widespread enough to make an impact. So it's a bit of an act of faith, I think, that social scientists with data are reliable, and the information we have is reliable, and we can actually do something. But can we agree? If we can't agree on guns, can we at least agree to try to do something like this? It almost sounds like something out of the 60s, doesn't it, Clay? You know, back in the day when we used to talk about preventing poverty and early, that's where Head Start and the Child's Life came from. All those programs that were sort of naive or seem naive to us today.
Mr. DiPiazza, we so appreciate your time. We'd like to check in with you 1 year from now in June of 2023 to get a sense of where you are, where the community is, what's been resolved, and whether any of the very modest reforms that you have suggested will be adopted by Uvalde or other places. You've been listening to a very important and difficult edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We'll see you all next week for another important meeting of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.